The witching hour. Sophie couldn't sleep. A brilliant moonbeam was slanting through a gap in the curtains. It was shining right onto her pillow. The other children in the dormitory had been asleep for hours. Sophie closed her eyes and lay quite still. She tried very hard to doze off. It was no good. The moonbeam was like a silver blade slicing through the room onto her face. The house was absolutely silent. No voices came up from downwards. There were no footsteps on the floor above either. The window behind the curtains was wide open, and nobody was walking on the pavement outside. No cars went on by the street. Not the tiniest sound could be heard anywhere. Sophie had never known such a silence. Perhaps, she told herself, this was what they called the witching hours. The witching hour, somebody had once whispered to her, was a special moment in the middle of the night when every child and every grown-up was in a deep, deep sleep, and all the dark things came out from hiding and had the world to themselves. The moonbeam was brighter than ever on Sophie's pillow. She decided to get out of the bed and close the gap in the curtains. You got punished if you were caught out of bed after lights out. Even if you said you had to go to the lavatory, there was no accepted as an excuse, and they punished you just the same. But there was no one about now. Sophie was sure of that. She reached out of her glasses, then lay on the chair beside her bed. They had steel rims and very thick lenses, and she could hardly see a thing without them. She put them on, then she slipped out of bed and tiptoed over to the window. When she reached the curtains, Sophie hesitated. She longed to duck underneath them and lean out of the window to see what the world looked like now that the witching hour was at hand. She listened again. Everywhere it was deadly still. The longing to look out became so strong she couldn't resist it. Quickly, she ducked under the curtains and leaned out of the window. In the silvery moonlight, the village street she knew so well seemed completely different. The houses looked bent and crooked like houses in a fairy tale. Everything was pale and ghostly, like milky white. Across the road, she could see Mrs. Rance's shop, where you bought buttons and wool and bits of elastic. It didn't look real. There was something dim and misty about that too. Sophie allowed her eye to travel farther and farther down the street. Suddenly she froze. There was something coming up the street on the opposite side. It was something black, something tall and black, something very tall and very black and very thin. Who? It wasn't a human. It couldn't be. It was 4 times as tall as the tallest human. It was so tall its head was higher than the upstairs windows of the houses. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat, like her whole body, was frozen with fright. This was the witching hour, all right. The tall black figure was coming her way. It was keeping very close to the houses across the street, hiding the shadowy places where there was no moonlight. And on it came, nearer and nearer. But it was moving in spurts. It would stop when it would move on, then it would stop again. But what on earth was it going? Ha! Sophie could see now it was up to. It was stopping in front of each house. It would stop and peer into the upstairs window of each house in the street. It actually had to bend down to peer into the upstairs windows. That's how tall it was. It would stop and peer in, then it would slide on the next house and stop again and peer and so on all along the street. It was much closer now, and Sophie could see it more clearly. Looking at it carefully, she decided it had to be some kind of person. Obviously, it was not a human, but it was definitely a person, a giant person, perhaps. Sophie stared hard across the misty moonlight street. The giant, if that was what he was wearing a long black cloak. In one hand, he was holding what looked like a very long, thin trumpet. In the other hand, he held a large suitcase. The giant had stopped now right in front of Mr. and Mrs. Goosh's house. The Gooshes had greengrocer's shop in the middle of the high street, and the family lived about the shop. The two Gooshy children slept in the upstairs front room. Sophie knew that. The giant was peering through the window into the room where Michael and Jane Gooshy was sleeping. From across the street, Sophie watched and held her breath. She saw the giant step back a place and put his suitcase down on the pavement. He bent over and opened a suitcase. He took something out of it. It looked like a glass jar, one of those square ones with a screw top. He unscrewed the top of the jar and poured what was it into the end of the long trumpet thing. She saw the giant straighten up again, and she saw him poke the trumpet in through the open upstairs window of the room where the Gooshy children were sleeping. She saw the giant take a deep breath, and woof, he blew through the trumpet. No noise came out, but it was obvious to Sophie that whatever had been in the jar had now been blown through the trumpet into the Gooshy children's bedroom. What could it be? as the giant withdrew the trumpet from the window and bent down to pick up the suitcase, he happened to turn his head and glance across the street. In the moonlight, Sophie caught a glimpse of an enormous, long, pale, wrinky face with the most enormous ears. The nose was as sharp as a knife, and above the nose there were two bright flashing eyes, and the eyes were staring straight at Sophie. There was a fierce and devilish look about them. Sophie gave a yelp and pulled back from the window. She flew across the dormitory and jumped into her bed and hid under the blanket. And there she crouched, still as a mouse, and tingling all over. The snatch. Under the blanket, Sophie waited. After a minute or so, she lifted a corner of the blanket and peeped out. For the second time that night, her blood froze to ice and she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. There at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was the enormous, long, pale, wrinky face of the giant person, staring at it. The flashing black eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking in through the window. This was followed by an arm as thick as a tree trunk, and the arm, the hand, the fingers were reaching out across the room towards Sophie's bed. This time Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because very quickly the huge hand clamped down over her blanket, and the scream was smothered by the bedclothes. Sophie, crouching underneath the blanket, felt strong fingers grasping hold of her, and then she was lifted up from her bed, blanket and all, and whisked out of the window. If you can't think of anything more terrifying that happening to you in the middle of the night, then let's hear about it. The awful thing was that Sophie knew exactly what was going on, although she couldn't see it happening. She knew that a monster or giant with an enormous, long, pale, wrinky face and dangerous eyes had plucked her from bed in the middle of the witching hour and was now carrying her out through the window, smothered in a blanket. What actually happened next was this. When the giant had got Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so he could grasp all the four corners of it at once in one of his huge hands, with Sophie imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized his suitcase and the long trumpet things, and off he ran. Sophie, by screaming around inside the blanket, managed to push the top of her head out through a little gap just below the giant's hand. She stared around her. She saw the village houses rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down the high street. He was running so fast his black cloak was streaming out behind him like the wings of a bird. Each stride he took was racing across the moonlight fields. Then he just dived in. The fields were no problem to the giant. He simply strode over them. A wide river appeared in his path. He crossed it one flying stripe. Sophie crouched in the blanket, peering out. She was being pummeled against the giant's leg like a sack of potatoes. Over the fields and hedges and rivers they went, and after a while a frightening thought came into Sophie's head. The giant is running fast, she told herself, because he is hungry and he wants to get home as quickly as possible, and then he'll have me for breakfast. The cave. The giant ran on and on. But how a curious change took place in his way of running. He seemed suddenly to go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went. As soon he was traveling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung Sophie's cheeks. It made her eyes water. It wiped her head back and whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation. They were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or sea. This giant had come sort of a magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that she had to duck down again into the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? It certainly felt that was to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed like hours. Then all at once the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head up out of the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down. It was now running more normally. Although normal was a silly word to use to describe a galloping giant. He leaped over meadows and rivers. He went rattling through a great forest, then down into the valley and up over a range of hills as bears concentrate. As soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was no quiet of this earth. The ground was flat and pale yellow. Great lumps of the blue rocks were scattered around, and dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie, still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her great raging mountain. The mountain was dark blue and all around in the sky was gushing and glistering with light. Bits of pale gold were flying among delicate, frosty white flakes of cloud, and all over one side the rim of the morning sun was coming up red as blood. Right beneath the mountain, the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great chest was heaving it and out. He paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it had been a football, and now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in the one hand, the trumpet and the suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into the place so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. "He is getting ready to eat me," she told herself. "He will probably eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he will boil me first. Or he will have me fried. He will drop me like a rasher of bacon into some gigantic frying pan, sizzling with fat." A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern with high rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that he didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were fat too short in the legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole in the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through thick steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down and rubbing his hands together. "What has us got there?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. The BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. "Now he really is going to eat me," Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "Is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. "Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Just because I is a giant, you think that I is a man-goblin cannibal," he shouted. "Yes, about right. Giant is so cannibal-y and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. Where is giant country now? Giant is everywhere around. Out there us has the famous bone-crouching giant." Bone-crouching giant crushes up 2 whoopsie whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-busting. Noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles among. "Ouch," Sophie said. "Bone-crouching giant just only gobbles human beings from Turkey." The giant said, "Every night Bone Cruncher is scalloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patricianism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?" "Bone-crunching giant says Turks it's tasting. However, so much is here." Bone Cruncher said Turkish humans beans had a glamourly flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey. "I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Of course they would," the giant shouted. "Every human being is deadly indifferent. Some is Greek and full of uglish. No giant is eating Greeks, ever." "Why not?" Sophie asked. "Greeks from Greece, and all tasting greasy," the giant said. "I imagine that's possible too," Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of a tremble what all things taken about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, they simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just woken up and appetited by talking about food. "As I'm saying," the giant went on, "all human beings is having different flavors. Human beans from Panama is tasting very strong of hats. Why hats? Sophie said. You is not very clever, the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than Bundoggle. Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food. You're trying to change the subject, the giant said sternly. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of the human being. The human being is not a vegetable. Oh, the human being is a vegetable, Sophie said. Not the human being, said Giant. The human being has 2 legs and vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was make the giant cross. The human being, the giant went on, is coming in tillness of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting very whooshy of fish. There is something very fishy about Wales. You mean Wales? Sophie said. Wales is something quite different. Wales is Wales, the giant said. Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has an almost disgustable woolly tickle at the tongue, the giant said. The human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans. You mean jerseys? Sophie said. You are once again gobble-funking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is a serious and snitching subject. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Your Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs, the giant went on. Of course, Sophie said, their taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping high tight. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because it's tasting of Labradors. When do the people of Labrador taste of? Sophie asked. Danes, the giant cried triumphantly. Great Danes! Aren't you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie said. It is a very mixed up giant, the giant said. But it does do my best. And is not nearly as mixed up as other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. Wellington? Sophie said. Where is Wellington? Your head is full of squashed flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumptious taste, so says the well-eaten giant. What do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked. Boots, the giant said. Of course, Sophie said. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than be kept hanging around anymore. "What sort of human beings do you usually eat?" she asked, trembling. "Me?" shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass rattle on their shelves. "Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes, all the others, he's gobbling them up every night, but not me. It is a freaky, yes? It's a nice and I nice and a complete giant. It's the only nice and complete giant in giant country. I is the big friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name?" "My name is Sophie," Sophie asked, and said, hardly daring to believe the good news she had just heard. The giants. "If you are so nice and friendly," Sophie said, "then why did you snatch me from my bed and run away with me?" "Because you saw me," the big friendly giant answered. "If anyone is seeing a giant, he or she must be taken away, Hipwitch." "Why?" asked Sophie. "Well, first of all," said the BFG, "human beings is not really believing in giants, is they? Human beings is not thinking we exist." "I do," Sophie said. "Ah, that is only because you had seen me," cried the BFG. "I cannot possibly allow anyone, even little girls, to be seeing me and staying at home. The first thing you would be doing, you would be scuttling around, yodeling the news that you were actually seeing a giant, and then a great giant hunt, a mighty giant look-see, would be starting up all over the world, with the human beings and rummaging for the great giant you saw and getting wildly excited. People would be coming rushing and bashing after me with goodness know what, and they would be catching me and looking me into a cage to be stared at. They would be putting me into the zoo or the punk mouse with those squiggling himpa dumplings and crocodile-diles. Sophie knew that what the giant said was true. If any person reported actually having seen a giant haunting the streets of her town at night, there would be most certainly be a terrific hullabaloo across the world. "I will bet you," the BFG went on, "that you would have been splashing the news all over the wonky world, wouldn't you, if I hadn't wiggled you away?" "I suppose I would," Sophie said. "And what would never do," said the BFG. "So what will happen to me now?" Sophie asked. "If you go back, you will be telling the world," said the BFG, "most likely on Telly Buncombe books on the radio squeaker. So you will just have to be staying here with me for the rest of your life." "Oh no," cried Sophie. "Oh yes," cried the BFG. "I am warning you not ever to go whiffling about out of his cave without this. I wish you do, you will be coming to a ucky-mucky end. I is showing you now who is going to eat you up if they ever catch even a tiny little glimpse of you. The big friendly giant picked Sophie off the table and carried her to the cave entrance. He rolled the huge stone to one side and said, "Peep out over there, little girl, and tell me what is you seen." Sophie, sitting on the BFG hand, peeped out of the cave. The sun was up now and shining fiercely hot of the great yellow wasteland with its blue rocks and dead trees. "Is you seeing them?" the BFG asked. Sophie, squinting through the glare of the sun, saw several tremendous tall figures moving among the rocks about 500 yards away. There were 4 others were sitting quite motionless on the rocks themselves. "This is giant country," the BFG said. "Those is all giants, everyone." It was a brain-boggling sight. The giants were all naked except for a sort of short skin around their waists, and their skins were burnt brown by the sun. But it was the sheer size of each one of them that boggled Sophie's brain most of all. They were simply colossal, far taller and wider than the big friendly giant upon whose hand she was now sitting. And oh, how ugly they were! Many of them had large bellies. All of them had long arms and big feet. They were too far away for their faces to be seen clearly, and perhaps that was a good thing. "What on earth are they doing?" Sophie asked. "Nothing," said the BFG. "They's just mooching and fooching around and waiting for the night to come. Then they all be galloping off to the places where people is living to find their suppers." "You mean to Turkey?" Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant will be galloping to Turkey, of course," said the BFG, "but the others will be waffling off to all sorts of flung-away places, like Wellington for the woody flavor and Panama for the heady taste. Every giant is having his own favorite hunting ground." "Do they ever go to England?" Sophie asked. "Often," said the BFG. "They say the English is tasting ever so wonderfully of frobscottle." "I'm not quite sure I know that what means," Sophie said. "Meanings, it's not important," said the BFG. "I cannot be right all the time. Quite often I is left instead of right." "And all those beastly giants over there really going off again tonight to eat people?" Sophie asked. "All of them is guzzling human beings every night." "But eating people is horrible," Sophie cried. "It's frightful. Why doesn't someone stop them?" "And who, please, is going to be stopping them?" asked the BFG. "Couldn't you?" said Sophie. "Never in a pig's whistle," cried the BFG. "All of those mean eating giants are enormous and very fierce. This all at least 2 times my wideness, endowed by royal highness. Twice as high as you, cried Sophie. Easily that, said the BFG. You've seen them in the distance, but just wait till you get them close up. Those giants is all at least 50 feet tall, with huge muscles and cockles alive, oh. It is a teaching one. I is their aunt. 24 feet is puddle nuts in giant country. You mustn't feel bad about it. Sophie said, I think you are just great. Why, even your toes must be as big as sausages. Bigger, said the BFG, looking pleased. They is as big as bumble hammers. How many giants are there out there? Sophie asked. 9 altogether, answered the BFG. This means, said Sophie, that somewhere in the world every single night 9 rich people get carried away and eaten alive? More, said the BFG. It's all depending, and you see, oh, how big the human being is. Japanese beans is very small. So a giant will need to gobble about 6 Japanese before he's feeling full up. Other, like in Norway, people and Yankee toddlers is ever so much bigger than usually. 2 or 3 of those makers a good duck in. But do these disgusting giants go to every single country in the world? Sophie asked. All countries except in Greece is getting visited sometime or another. The BFG answered. The country which a kind visits it depending how he is feeling. If it's a very warm weather and the giant is feeling as hot himself as a Queen or to cool him down. An ice as fat as Queen to a giant is like a lovely ice cream lolly to you. I'll take your word for it, Sophie said. And then again, if it's a frosty night and then a giant frightening which cold, we will probably point his nose towards the swelling Hotlands to guzzle a new Hottentots to warm him up. How perfectly horrible, Sophie said. Nothing has a cold giant like a hot Hottentot, the BFG said. And if you were to beat me down on the ground and I was to duck out among them now, Sophie said, would they really eat me up? Like Whipplesweedle, cried the BFG, and what is more, you is so small that he wouldn't even have to chew you. The first one to be seeing you would pick you up in his fingers down, and you'd like a drop of drain water. Let's go back inside, Sophie said. I hate even watching them. The marvelous ears. Back in the cave, big friendly giant, sat Sophie down once again on an enormous table. Is you quite snugly there in your nightie? He asked. You isn't frigid cold? I'm 9, Sophie said. I cannot help thinking, said the BFG, about your poor mother and father. By now they must be chipping and scuffling all over the house, shouting, hello, hello, where's Sophie gone? I don't have a mother and father, Sophie said. They both died when I was a baby. Oh, you poor little scumpit, cried the BFG. Is you not missing them very badly? Not really, Sophie said, because I never knew them. You's making me sad, the BFG said, rubbing his eyes. Don't be sad, Sophie said. No one is going to be worrying too much about me. The place you took me from was the village orphanage. Were all the orphans in there? So you're an orphan? Yes. How many is there in there? 10 of us, Sophie said. All the girls. Was you happy there? The BFG asked. I hated it, Sophie said. The woman who ran it was called Mrs. Conkers, and if she caught you breaking any of the rules, like getting out of bed at night or not folding up your clothes, you got punished. How is you getting punished? She locks us in a dark cellar for a day and night without anything to eat or drink. The rotten old rot rasper, cried the BFG. It was so horrid, Sophie said. We used to dread it. There was rats down there. We could hear them creeping about. The filthy old Whistler, shouted the BFG. What is the horriest thing I heard for years? You're making me sadder than ever. All at once, a huge tear that would have filled a bucket roller down one of the BFG's cheeks and fell with a splash on the floor. It made quite a puddle. Sophie watched with astonishment. What a strange and moody creature this is, she thought. One moment he's telling me my head is full of quashed flies, and the next moment his heart is melting from me because Mrs. Clockers locks us in the cellar. The thing that worries me, Sophie said, is having to stay in this dreadful place for the rest of my life. The orphanage was pretty awful, but I wouldn't have been there forever, wouldn't I? All is all my fault, the BFG said. Is the one who kidnapped you? Yes, another enormous tear fell from his eyes and splashed on the floor. Now I come to think of it, I won't actually be here all that long, Sophie said. It is afraid you will, the BFG said. No, I won't, Sophie said. Those brutes out there are bound to catch me sooner or later and have me for tea. I's never letting that happen, the BFG said. For a few moments the cave was silent. Then Sophie said, May I ask you a question? The BFG wiped the tears from his eyes with the back of his hand and gave Sophie a long, thoughtful stare. Shoot away, he said. Would you please tell me what you were doing in our village last night? Why were you poking that long trumpet thing into the gushy children's bedroom and then blowing through it? Ha ha, cried the BFG, sitting up suddenly in his chair. Now we is getting noisier than a Parker. And the soaked suitcase you were carrying," Sophie said. "What on earth was that about?" The BFG stared suspiciously at a small girl sitting cross-legged on the table. "You is asking me to tell you who's big secret," he said. "Secrets that nobody is ever hearing before." "I won't tell a soul," Sophie said. "I swear it. How could I anyway? I'm stuck here for the rest of my life." "You could be telling the other giants." "No, I couldn't," Sophie said. "You told me they would eat me up the moment they saw me." "And so they would," said the BFG. "You is a human being, and human beings is like strawberries and cream to those giants. If they are going to eat me the moment that you see me, then I wouldn't have time to tell them anything, wouldn't I?" Sophie said. "You wouldn't," said the BFG. "When why did you say I might?" "Because I is a brimful of buzzburgers," the BFG said. "If you listen to everything I am saying, you will be getting an earache." "Please tell me what you were doing in our village," Sophie said. "I promise you can trust me." "Would you teach me how to make an elephant?" the BFG asked. "What do you mean?" Sophie said. "I would dearly love to have an elephant to ride on." The BFG said dreamily, "I would so much love to have a jumpy big elephant to go riding through the green forest and picking peachy fruits off the trees all day long. This is a sizzling hot mug pumpkin country we're living in. Nothing grows in it except Snazcumbers. I would have to go somewhere else and pick peachy fruits in the early morning from the back of an elephant." Sophie was quite moved by his curious statement. "Perhaps one day we will get you an elephant," she said, "and peachy fruits as well. Now tell me what you are going to do in our village." "If you's really wanting to know that I'm doing in your village," the BFG said, "it is blowing a dream into a bedroom of those children." "Blowing a dream?" Sophie said. "What do you mean?" "It is a dream-blowing giant," the BFG said. "When all the other giants is galloping off every what way and wish to swallow human beings, it is scuttling away to other place to blow dreams into the bedrooms of sleeping children." "Nice dream, a lovely golden dreams. Dream that is giving the dreams a happy time. Now hang on a minute." Sophie said, "Where do you get these dreams?" "I collect them," the BFG said, waving an arm towards all the rows and rows of bottles on the shelves. "I has billions of them." "You can't collect a dream," Sophie said. "A dream isn't something you can catch hold of." "You's never going to understand it," the BFG said. "That is why I's not wishing to tell you." "Oh, please tell me," Sophie said. "I will understand. Go on, tell me how you collect dreams. Tell me everything." The BFG settled himself comfortably in his chair and crossed his legs. Dreams, he said, is a very mysterious thing. He's floating around in the air like little wispy misty bubbles, and all the time they're searching for sleeping people. Can you see them? Sophie asked. Never at first. Then how do you catch them if you can't see him? Sophie asked. Ha, the beverages said. Now he's getting onto the dark and dusky secrets. I won't tell a soul. I is trusting you, the beverages said. He closed his eyes and sat quite still for a moment while Sophie waited. A dream, he said, as it goes whiffling through the night air. It makes a tiny little buzzing mumbling noise. But this little buzzy hum, it's too still very soft. It is impossible for a human being to be hearing it. Can you hear it? Sophie asked. The BFG pointed up at his enormous drag-wheeled ears, which he now began to move in and out. He performed his exercise proudly, with a little proud smile on his face. Is you seeing this? He asked. How could I miss them? Sophie said. They may be looking a bit preposterous to you. BFG said, but you must believe me when I say it's a very extra usual ears indeed. It's not to be codded at. I'm quite sure they are not, Sophie said. They's allowing me to hear absolutely every single tweety little thing. You mean you can hear things I can't hear? Sophie said, hearing only thumping loud noise with those little earrings of yours. But I'm hearing all the secrets whispering of the world. Such as what? Sophie asked. In your country, he said, I is a hearing of footsteps of a ladybird as she goes walking across a leaf. Honestly? Sophie said, beginning to be impressed. That's more. I is hearing those footsteps very loud, the BFG said, when a ladybird is walking across a leaf. I is hearing her there feel all going clumpty clumpty clump like giant footsteps. Good gracious me, Sophie said, what else can you hear? I is hearing the little ants chittering to each other as they scuttle around in the soil. You mean you can hear ants talking? Every single word, the BFG said. Although I is not exactly understanding their language. Go on, Sophie said. Sometimes on a very clear night, the BFG said, and I swinging my ears in the right direction, and there he swiveled his great ears upward so do they facing the ceilings. If I just wiggle them like this, and the night is very clear, it is something hearing faraway music coming from the stars in the sky. A curious little shiver passed through Sophie's body. They sat very quiet, waiting for more. My ears is what told me you was watching me out of your window last night, the BFG said. But I didn't make a sound, Sophie said. I was hearing your heart beating across the road, the BFG said. Loud as a drum. Go on, Sophie said, please. I can hear plants and trees. Do they talk? Sophie asked. It's not exactly talking, the BFG said, but there's making noises. For instance, if I come along and I is picking a lovely flower, if I is twisting them on the flower till it breaks, then the plants are screaming. I can't hear it screaming. It's screaming very clear. You don't mean it, Sophie cried. How awful. It is screaming just like you would be screaming if someone was twisting your arm right off. Is that really true? Sophie asked. You think I is twisting you? It's rather hard to believe. Then I is stopping right here, said the BFG sharply. I is not wishing to be called a fibister. Oh no, I'm not calling you anything, Sophie cried. I believe you, I do really. Please go on. The BFG gave her a long, hard stare. Sophie looked right back at him, her face open to his. I believe you, she said softly. She had offended him. She could see that. I would never be fibbling you, he said. I know you wouldn't, Sophie said, but you must understand that it isn't easy to believe such amazing things right away. I understand that, the BFG said. So do please forgive me and go on, she said. He waited a while longer, and then he said, it is the time with trees and it is with flowers. If I is chopping an egg into the trunk of a big tree, I is hearing a terrible sound coming from inside the heart of the tree. What sort of sound? Sophie asked. A sort of moaning sound, the BFG said. It's like the sound an old man is making when he's dying slowly. He paused. The cave was very silent. Trees, he's living and growing just like you as me, he said. They is alive, so is plants. He was sitting very straight in his chair now, his hands clasped tightly together in front of him. His face was bright, his eyes round and bright as 2 stars. Such wonderful and terrible sounds I is hearing, he said. Some of them you would never wish to be hearing yourself, but some is like glorious music. He seemed almost to be transfigured by the excitements of his thoughts. His face was beautiful in its place of emotions. Tell me some more about them, Sophie said quietly. You just ought to be hearing the little mice talking. He said, little mice is always talking to each other, and I is hearing them as loud as my own voice. So what they say? Sophie asked. Only the mice know that, he said. Spiders is also talking a great deal. You might not be thinking it, but spiders is the most tremendous letterboxes. And while they is spinning their webs, they is singing all the time. They is singing sweeter and 9 to go. Who else do you hear? Sophie asked. One of the biggest chatbags is the cattle beetles, the BFG said. What do they say? They are arguing all the time about who is going to be prettiest butterfly. That is all they's ever talking about. Is there a dream floating around in here now? Sophie asked. The BFG moved his great ears this way and that, listening intently. He shook his head. There is no dream in here, he said, except in the bottles. I had a special place to go for catching dreams. And it's not often common to giant country. How do you catch them? The same way you catching butterflies, the BFG answered, with a net. He stood up and crossed over the corner of the cave where Paul was leaning against the wall. The pole was about 30 feet long, and there was a net on the end of it. Here's a dream catcher, he said, grasping the pole in the one hand. Every morning I is going out and snatching new dreams to put in my bottles. Suddenly he seemed to lose interest in the conversation. I is getting hungry, he said. It's time for it. Snazcumbers. But if you don't eat people like all others, Sophie said, then what do you live on? That is a squelching tricky problem around here, the BFG answered. In this slush-filled giant country, happy eats like pineapples and pink winkles is simply not growing. Nothing is growing except for the all extremely Aikipu vegetables. It's called Snazcumber. The Snazcumber, cried Sophie. There is no such thing. The BFG looked at Sophie and smiled, showing about 20 of his square white teeth. Yesterday, he said, we was not only believing in giant, was we? Today we're not believing in Snazcumbers just because we happen not to have actually seen something with our own 2 little winkles. We think it is not existing. What about, for instance, the great squeezy scotchhopper? I beg your pardon, Sophie said. And a hopple crimp? What's that? Sophie cried. And what raw pebble? What's that? Sophie cried. And a crumbscoat? Are they animals? Sophie asked. It is the common animals, said the BFG contemptuously. I is a not well known old giant myself, but it seems to me that you is an absolutely know-nothing human being. Your brain is full of rotten wool. You mean cotton wool, Sophie said. What I mean and what I say is 2 different things, the BFG announced it rather grandly. I will now show you a Snazcumbers. The BFG flung open a massive cupboard and took out the weirdest looking thing Sophie had ever seen. It was about half as long a case as an ordinary man, but was much thicker. It was as thick around its girth as a perambulator. It was in black with white stripes along its length, and it was covered all over with curved knobbles. Here is a repulse Snazcumbers, cried the BFG, waving it about. I squoggle it, I misplied, I distung it, because I is refusing to gobble up human beings like the other giants. I must spend my life guzzling up icy poo Snazcumbers instead. If I don't, I will be nothing but skin and groans. Human skin and bones, Sophie said. I know it is a bones, the BFG said, but please understand that I cannot be helping if I sometimes say things a little squeechly. I is trying to my best all the time. The big friendly giant looked suddenly to forlorn the Sophie gets quite upset. I'm sorry, she had. I didn't mean to be rude. There never was any schools to teach me talk in a giant country, the BFG said sadly. But couldn't your mother have taught you? Sophie asked. My mother, cried the BFG. Giants don't have mothers. Surely you knowing that. I did know that, Sophie cried. Who ever heard of a woman giant? Shouted the BFG, waving the Snazcumber around his head like a lasso. There was never a woman giant, and there was never will be one. Giant is always man. Sophie felt herself getting a little muddled. In that case, she said, how are you born? Giants isn't born, the BFG answered. Giants appears, and that's all there is to it. They simply appears the same as the sun and the stars. And where did you appear? Sophie asked. Now, how on earth could I be knowing a thing like that? Said the BFG. I was so long ago I couldn't count. You mean you don't even know how old you are? No giant is knowing that, the BFG said. All as I knowing about myself is that I is very old, very, very old and crumbly, perhaps as old as the earth. What happens when a giant dies? Sophie asked. Giant is never dying, the BFG answered. Sometimes, and quite suddenly, the giant is disappearing and nobody is ever knowing where he goes to. But mostly us giants is simply going on and on like whistly time twiddles. The BFG was still holding the awesome Snazcumbers in his right hand, and now he put one end into his mouth and beat off a huge hunk of it. He started crunching it up, and the noise he made was like crunching of lumps of ice. It's filthy, he spluttered, speaking with his mouth full of spraying large pieces of Snazcumbers like bullets in Sophie's direction. Sophie hopped around on the tabletop, ducking out of the way. It's dangerous, the BFG carted. It's sickable, it's rosome, it's maggot-sweet. Try it yourself, this fulsome Snazcumber. No, thank you, Sophie said, backing away. It's all you're going to be calling around here from now on, so you might as well get used to it, said the BFG. Go on, you nispy little Winky, have a go. Sophie took a small bite nibble. Ugh, she spluttered. Oh no, oh gosh, oh help. She spat it out quickly. It tastes of frog skins. She gasped. And rotten fish. Worse than that, cried the BFG, roaring with laughter. To me, it's tasting of cockroaches and smile wankles. Do we really have to eat it? Sophie said. You do, unless you is wanting to become so thin you will be disappearing into a thick ear. Into a thin ear, Sophie said. A thick ear is something quite different. Once again, that sad, winsome look came into the BFG's eyes. Words, he said, is all such twitch tickling problems to me all my life, so you must simply try to be patient and stop squibbling. As I am telling you before, I know exactly that words I am wanting to say, but somehow or other there is always getting squiffled around. That happens to everyone, Sophie said. Not like it happened to me, the BFG said. I is speaking the most terrible Wiglish. I think you speak beautifully, Sophie said. You do? Cried the BFG, suddenly brightening. You really do? Simply beautifully? Sophie repeated. Well, that is the nicest present anybody is ever given me in my whole life, cried the BFG. Are you sure he is not tweeting my leg? Of course not, Sophie said. I just love the way you talk. How wondercump, cried the BFG, still beaming. How whoopsies punkets, how absolutely squiffling. It's all of stutter. Listen, Sophie said. We don't have to eat Snazcumbers in the fields around our village. There are all sorts of lovely vegetables, like cauliflowers and carrots. Why don't you get some of those next time you go visiting? The BFG raised his great head proudly in the air. It is a very honorable giant, he said. I would rather be chewing uproot some Snazcumbers than snatching things from other people. You stole me, Sophie said. I did not steal you very much, said the BFG, smiling gently. After all, you was only a tiny little girl. The blood bottler. Suddenly, a tremendous trumping noise came from outside the cave entrance, and the voice like thunder shouted, Ront, is you there, Ront? Is hearing you, Chaplain? Who is Chaplain Durant? Look out, cried the BFG. It is the blood bottler. But before he had finished speaking, the stone was rolled aside, and 50-foot giant, more than twice as tall as wide as the BFG, came striding into the cave. He was naked, except for a dirty little piece of cloth around his bottom. Sophie won on the tabletop. The enormous partly eaten Snazcumber was lying near here. She ducked behind it. The creature came clumping into the cave and stood towering over the BFG. Who was you traveling to here just now? He boomed. I is traveling myself, the BFG answered. Beverages, shouted the blood bottler. Boxwell, he boomed. You is talking to a human being. That's what I thinking. No, no, cried the BFG. Yes, yes, boomed the blood bottler. I is guessing you has snitched away human being and brought it back to you, Punko, as a pet. So now I is winking it out and guzzling in extra snacks before my supper. The poor BFG was very nervous. There is no one in there, he stammered. Why don't you have me alone? The blood butler pointed a finger as large as tree trunk as the BFG. Run to little scum-skewer, he shouted. Piffling little swinchfiggler, scream a little bottle wet, blunt the little buckwizzer. I is now going to search the prime noses. He gobbled the BFG by the arm. And you is going to help me do this. Us together is going to winkle out the tasteful little human being, he shouted. The BFG had intended to whisk Sophie off the table as soon as she got the chance to hide her behind her back, but now there was no hope of doing this. Sophie peered around the chewed-off end of an enormous Snazcumber, watching the two giants as they moved away down the cave. The blood butter was a gruesome sight. Her skin was reddish-brown. There was some black hair sprouting on his chest and arms and on his stomach. The hair on his head was long and dark and tangled. His full face was round and squashy-looking. The eyes were tiny black holes. The nose was small and flat, but the mouth was huge. It spread right across the face, almost ear to ear, and it had lips that were two like gigantic purple frankfurters lying on the top of the other. Great yellow teeth stuck out between the two purple frankfurter lips, and rivers of sleep ran down over the chin. It was not in the least difficult to believe that these ghastly brood ate men, women, and children every night. The blood blutter, still holding the BFG by the arm, was examining the rows and the rows of bottles. And your peopling bottles, he shouted. Why is you putting in them? Nothing that would interest you, the BFG answered. You is only interested in puzzling human beings. And you is study of dog burglar, cried the blood butler. Soon the blood bottle would be coming back, Sophie told herself, and he was bound to search the tabletop. But she couldn't possibly jump off the table. It was 12 feet high. She'd break a leg. The Snazcumber, although it was as thick as pyramid tabler, was not going to hide her if the blood matter picked it up. She examined the chewed-off end. It had large seeds in the middle, each one as big as melon. They were embedded in soft, slimy stuff. Taking care to stay out of sight, Sophie reached forward and scooped away half a dozen of these seeds. This left a hole in the middle of the Snazcumbers large enough for her to crouch in so long as she rolled herself into a ball. She crawled into it. It was a wet, slimy hiding place, but what did that matter if it was going to save her from being eaten? The blood butler and the BFG were coming back towards the table now. The BFG was nearly fainting with fear. Any moment, he was telling himself, Sophie would be discovered and eaten. Suddenly, the blood butler grabbed the half-eaten Snazcumber. The BFG stared at the bare table. Sophie, where is you? He thought desperately. You cannot possibly be tumbling off that high table, so where is you hiding, Sophie? So this is the filthy roastsome club that you're eating, boomed the blood butler, holding up the partly eaten Snazcumber. You must be cockles to be causing such rubsquash. For a moment the black bottle seemed to have forgotten about his search of Sophie. The BFG decided to lead him farther off the track. That is, he said, it is a constant, is gravely every night a day. Is he even trying, Snazcumber, blood butler? Human beings is juicier, the blood butler said. You is talking Ramatot, the BFG said, growing braver by the second. He was thinking that if only he could get the blood butler to take one bite of the repulsive vegetable, the sheer foulness of its flavor would send him billowing out on the cave. It is happy to let you sample it, the BFG went on, but please, when you see how truly scrumptious it is, don't be guzzling the whole thing. Leave me a little snitcher for my supper. The blood butler stared suspiciously with small piggy eyes at a Snazcumber. Sophie, crouching inside the chewed-off end, began to tremble all over. You is not switch-feeding me, is you? Said the blood butler. Never, cried the BFG passionately. Take a bite, and then I'm positive you will be shouting out of how scum delicious the Wonderland is. The BFG could see the greedy blood butler's mouth beginning to water more than ever at the prospect of extra food. Vegetables is very good for you, he went on. It is not wholesome always to be eating meaty things. Just this once, the blood butler said, is going to taste these roast meats of yours. But I warning you that if it's filthsome, it is smashing it over your sluggy little head. He picked up the Snazcumber. He began racing it on its long journey to his mouth, some 50 feet up in the air. Sophie wanted to scream, "Don't!" but there would have been an even more certain death. Crouching among the slimy seeds, she felt herself being lifted up and up and up. Suddenly there was a crunch as the blood butler bit a huge hunk off the end. Sophie saw his yellow teeth clamping together a few inches from her head. Then there was utter darkness. She was in his mouth. She got a whiff of his evil-smelling breath. It stank of bad meat. She waited for the teeth to go crunch once more. She prayed that she would be killed quickly. "Ouch!" roared the blood butler. "Ouch!" and he spat. All of the great lumps of Snazcumber that were in his mouth, as well as Sophie herself, went shooting out across the cave. If Sophie had struck the stony wall of the cave, she would most certainly have been killed. Instead, she hit the soft folds of the BFG black cloak hanging against the wall. She dropped to the ground, half stunned. She crawled on the hem of the cloak, and there she crouched. "You little One burglar, roared the blood butler. You little pig swiller! He rushed at the BFG and smashed that was left on the Snazcumber over his head. Fragments of the filthy vegetable splashed all over the cave. You is not loving it? The BFG asked innocently, rubbing his head. Loving it? Yelled the blood butler. That is the most dexterous taste that is ever caught in my teeth. You must be pockets to be swallowing sludge like that. Every night you could be galloping off happy as a hamburger and gobbling juicy human beings. Eating human beings, he is wrong and devil, the BFG said. It is ghastly and scrumptious, shouted the blood blutter, and tonight I is galloping off the child to swabble a few human child beans. Is you wishing to know why I is choosing chili? I is not wishing to know anything, the BFG said, very frightened. I is choosing chili, the blood butler said, because I is fed up with the taste of Immerse. I is important. I has plenty of qualities in his being. Human beings from child is very chilly. Horrible, the BFG said. You ought to be ashamed. Other giants is all saying they is wanting to gallop off to England tonight to guzzle school children's. The blood butler said, I is very fond indeed of English school children's. They all have nice inky booky flavor. Perhaps I will change my mind and go to England with them. You is disgusting, the BFG said, and you is an insult to the giant peoples, shouted the blood butler. You is not fit to be a giant. You is a squinty little squiddler. You is a pimpling little pisquick. You is a cream puff nut. With that, the horrible blood-bottling giant strode out of the cave. The BFG ran to the cave entrance and quickly rolled the stall back into place. Sophie, he whispered, Sophie, where is you? Sophie. Sophie emerged from under the hem of the black cloak. I'm here, she said. The BFG picked her up and held her tenderly in the palm of his hand. Oh, I'm so happy to be finding you, all you in one lump, he said. I was in his mouth, Sophie said. You was that? Cried the BFG. Sophie told him that what had happened, and where there I was telling him to eat the filsome Snazcumber. And you was all the time inside it, the BFG cried. Not much fun, Sophie said. Just look at you, you poor little childer, cried the BFG. You is all covered. It's Snazcumber, a giant spit. He set about clearing her up as best he could. I is hating those other giants more than ever now, he said. You know what I should like? What? Sophie said. I should like to find a way of disappearing them, every single one. I'm glad to help you, Sophie said. Let me see if I can think up a way of doing it. Frobscottle and twist poppers. By now, Sophie was beginning to feel not only extremely hungry, but very thirsty as well. Had she been at home, she would have finished her breakfast long ago, Are you sure there is nothing else to eat around her except those disgusting smelly Snazcumbers? She asked. Not even a fishwinkle, answered the big friendly giant. In that case, may I please have a little water? She said. Water? Said the BFG, frowning mightily. What is water? We drink it, Sophie said. What do you drink? Frobscottle, announced the BFG. All giants is drinking frobscottle. It is as nasty as your Snazcumbers, Sophie asked. Nasty? Cried the BFG. Never it is a nasty. Frobscottle, it's sweet and jumbly. He got up from his chair and went to a second huge cupboard. He opened it and looked out a glass bottle that must have been 6 feet tall. The liquid inside was pale green, and the bottle was half full. Here's frobscottle, he cried, holding the bottle up out of high, as though it contained some rare wine. Delicious, fizzy frobscottle, he shouted. He gave it a snake, and green stuff began to fizz like mad. But look, it's fizzing the wrong way, Sophie cried. And indeed it was. The bubbles, instead of traveling upwards and bursting on the surface, were shooting downwards and bursting at the bottom. A pale green frothy fizz was forming at the bottom of the bottle. What on earth is he meaning the wrong way? Asked the BFG. In our fizzy drinks, Sophie said, the bubbles must always go up and burst at the top. Upwards in the wrong way, cried the BFG. You mustn't ever be having the bubbles going upwards. That's the most flashbanging rubbish I ever is hearing. Why do you say that? Sophie asked. You is asking me why? Cried the BFG, waving the enormous bottle around as though he were conducting an orchestra. You is actually meaning to tell me you cannot see why it is a Scotty mistake to have the bubbles flying up instead of down? You said it was flashbanging. Now you say it's Scotty. Which is this? Sophie asked politely. Both, cried the BFG. It is a flashbanging and Scotty mistake to let the bubbles go upwards. If you can't see why, you must be a quickie as a duck now. By Ringo, your head must be so full of Grusnickers and Boswangers, and as figured if you know how you can think at all. Why shouldn't the bubbles go upward? Sophie asked. I will explain, said the BFG. But tell me first, what name is your calling your frobscottle by? One is Coke, Sophie said. Another's Pepsi. There are lots of them. And the bubbles is all going up? They all go up, Sophie said. Catastrophes, cried the BFG. Upgoing bubbles is a catastrophe to poor. Will you please tell me why? Sophie said. If you will listen carefully, I will try to explain, said the BFG. But your brain is so full of backwaffles, I doubt you will ever understand. I'll do my best, Sophie said patiently. Very well then. When he is drinking this cookie, drink of yours, said the BFG. It is going straight down into your tummy. Is that right? or is it left? It's right, Sophie said. And the bubbles is going also in your tummy, right or left? Right again, Sophie said. And the bubbles is fizzling upwards. Of course, Sophie said. Which means, said the BFG, that they will all come swish-filling in your throat and out of your mouth and make a wholesome belchy burp. That's often true, Sophie said, but what's wrong with a little burp now and again? It's sort of fun. Burping is filsome, the BFG said. Us giants is never doing it. But with your drink, Sophie said, what was you'd called it? Frobscottle, said the BFG. With frobscottle, Sophie said, the bubbles in your tummy will be going downwards, and that could have a far nastier result. Why nasty? Asked the BFG, frowning. Because, Sophie said, blushing a little, if they go down instead of up, they'll be coming out somewhere else with an even louder and ruder noise. A whiz-popper, cried the BFG, beaming at her. Us giants is making whiz-poppers all the time. Whiz-popping is a sign of happiness. It is a music in our ears. You surely is not telling me that a little whiz-popping is forbidden among human beings? It is considered extremely rude, Sophie said, but your whiz-popping is you not, now and again? Asked the BFG. Everyone is whiz-popping, if that's you call it, Sophie said. Kings and queens are whiz-popping, presidents are whiz-popping, glamorous film stars are whiz-popping, little babies are whiz-popping. But where I come from, it is not polite to talk about it. Redonkulous, said the BFG. If everyone is making whiz-poppers, why they not talk about it? Where's no having a swiggle of this delicious frobscottle, and you will see the happy result. The BFG shook the bottle vigorously. The pale green stuff fizzed and bubbled. He removed the cork and took a tremendous guggling swig. It's glummy, he cried. I love it. For a few moments, the big friendly giant stood quite still, and a look of absolute ecstasy began to spread over his long, wrinkly face. Then suddenly the heavens opened, and he let fly with a series of loudest and rudest noises Sophie had ever heard in their life. They reverberated around the walls of the cave like thunder, and the glass jars rattled on their shelves. But most astonishing of all, the force of the explosions actually lifted the enormous giant clear off his feet like a rocket. Whoopee! He cried when he came down to earth again. Now that's a whiz-popping for you. Sophie burst out laughing. She couldn't help. Have some yourself, cried the BFG, tipping the neck of the enormous bottle towards her. Don't you have a cup? Sophie said. No cups, only bottle. Sophie opened her mouth, and very gently the BFG tipped the bottle forward and poured some of the fabulous frobscottle down her throat. And oh gosh, how delicious it was! It was sweet and refreshing. It tasted of vanilla and cream, with just the faintest trace of raspberries on the edge of the flavor. And the bubbles were wonderful. Sophie could actually feel them bouncing and bursting all around her tummy. It was an amazing sensation. It felt as though hundreds of tiny people were dancing a jig inside her and tickling her with their toes. It was lovely. "It's lovely," she cried. "Just wait," said a BFG, flapping his ears. Sophie could feel the bubbles traveling lower and lower down her tummy, and then suddenly, inevitably, the explosion came. The trumpet sounded, and she too made the waltz of the cavern ring with a loud and sound of music and thunder. "Bravo!" shouted the BFG, waving the bottle. "You is very good for a beginner. Let's have some more." Journey to the Dream Country. After the mad frobscottle party was over, Sophie settled herself again on top of the enormous table. "You is feeling better now?" asked the big friendly giant. "Much better," Sophie said. "Whatever, I is feeling a bit scotty," the BFG said. "I few cups of frobscottle is always making me happy again. I must say I'm quite an experience," Sophie said. "It's a rest whistle," the BFG said. "It's glarrumptious." He turned away the toad across the cave and picked up his dream-catching net. "It is galloping off now," he said, "to catch some more whoopee whiffling dreams for my collection. And is going to every day without missing. Is you wishing to come with me?" "Not me, thank you very much," Sophie said. "Not with those other giants lurking outside. I is snuggling you very cozy into the pocket of my waistcoat," the BFG said. "Then no one is seeing you." Before Sophie could protest, she had picked up her off the table and popped into the waistcoat pocket. There was a plenty of room, is there? "It's you wishing for a little hole to peep out from?" he asked her. "There is one here, lady," she said. She had found a small hole in the pocket, and when she put one eye close to it, she could see out very well indeed. She watched the BFG as she bent down and filled his suitcase with empty glass jars. He closed the lid, picked up the suitcase in one hand, took the pole with the net on the other hand, and marched towards the entrance of the cave. As soon as she was outside, the BFG set off across the great, hot yellow wasteland where the blue rocks lay and the dead trees stood and where all the other giants were skulking about. Sophie, squatting low on her heels on the pocket of the leather waistcoat, had one eye glued to the little hole. She saw the group of enormous giants about 300 yards ahead. "Hold your breath," the BFG whispered down to her. "Cross your fingers. Here we go. He is going right past all these other giants. Is you seeing that whooping great one, the one nearest to us?" "I see him," Sophie whispered back, quivering. "That is the horriblest of them all, and the biggest of them all. He is called the flesh-pounding giant." "I don't want to hear about him," Sophie said. He is 54 feet high, the BFG said softly as he jogged along. And he is swallowing human beans like the sugar lumps, 2 or 3 at a time. You're making me nervous. Sophie said, "I's nervous myself," the BFG whispered. "I always get as jumpy as Gookhopper when the flesh-eating giants is around." "Keep away from him," Sophie pleaded. "Not possible," the BFG answered. "He is galloping easily 2 times as quickly as me." "Shall we tug back?" Sophie said. "Turning back is worse," the BFG said. "If they seen me running away, they's all giving chase and throwing rocks." "They would ever eat you though, would they?" Sophie asked. "Giants is never cuddling over giants," the BFG said. "They's fighting and squirreling a lot with each other, but never cuddling. Human beings is more nasty to them." The giants had already spotted the BFG, and all heads were turned, watching him as he jogged forward. He was aiming to pass well to the right of the group. Through her little peephole, Sophie saw the flesh-eating giant moving over to intercept them. He didn't hurry. He just sloped over cautiously to a point where the BFG would have to pass. The others slooped after him. Sophie counted 9 of them altogether, and she recognized the blood butler in the middle of them. They were bored. They had nothing to do until nightfall. There was an air of menace about them as they looped slowly across the plain with long looping strides, heading for the BFG. "Here comes the runty one," boomed the flash Peter. "Ho, there, runty one! There is your Splatch winking away to his such healthy hurry." He snatched out an enormous arm and grabbed the BFG by the ear. The BFG didn't struggle. He simply stopped and stood quiet, still, and said, "Be so kind as to be letting go of my hair, Flesh and Peter." The Flesh and Peter released him and stepped back a pace. The other giants stood around waiting for the fun to start. "Now then, you little grub squiffler," boomed the Flesh Plumpeter. "We is all of us wanting to know where you is galloping off to every day in the daytime. Nobody ought to be galloping off to anywhere until it's getting dark. The human beings also could easily be spotting you and starting a game hunt, as we is not wanting to do happened, is we not?" "We is not," shouted the other giants. "Go back to your cave, runty one." "I's not galloping to any human being country," the BFG said. "He's going to other places." "I is thinking," said the Flesh and Peter, "that you's catching human beings and keeping them as pets." "Right you is," cried the blood butler. "Just now I is hearing him chittering away to one of them in his cave. You's welcome to go and search my cave from back to pond." The BFG answered, "You can go looking into every crook and nanny. There's no human beings, or strangely beings, or runner beans or jelly beans or any other beans in here. Sophie crouched still as a mouse inside the BFG's pocket. She hardly dared breathe. She was terrified she might sneeze. The slightest sound or movement would give her away. Through the tiny peephole, she watched the giants clustering around the poor BFG. How revolting they were! All of them had picky little eyes, an enormous mouth with thick sausage lips. When the flesh Lampeter was speaking, she got a glimpse of his tongue. It was jet black, like a slab of black stick. Every one of them was more than twice as tall as the BFG. Suddenly, the flesh Lampeter shot out two enormous hands and grabbed the BFG around the waist. He tossed him high in the air and shouted, "Catch him, Mangurer!" The Mangurer caught him. The other giants spread out quickly in a large circle, each giant about 20 yards from his neighbor, preparing for the game they were going to play. Now the Mangurer threw the BFG high and far, shouting, "Catch him, Banner Cruncher!" The Banner Cruncher ran forward and caught the tumbling BFG and immediately swung him up again. "Catch him, Child Chewer!" he shouted, and so it went on. The giants were playing ball with the BFG, weighing with each other to see who would throw him the highest. Sophie dug her nails into the sides of the pocket, trying to prevent herself from tumbling out when he was upside down. She felt as though they were in a peril going over the Niagara Falls. And all the time there was the fearful danger that one of the giants would fail to catch the BFG. He would go crashing to the ground. "Catch him, catch him, catch him, Blood Butler, catch him, Maid Masher." In the end, they got bored with the game. They tumbled the poor BFG on the ground. He was dazed and shattered. They gave him a few kicks and shouted, "Run, you little runt! Let us to be seen how fast you scallowing." The BFG ran. What else could he do? The giants picked up rocks and hurled them after him. He managed to dodge them. "Ruddy little runt!" they shouted. "Droggy little tweed! Shrivelly little shrimp! Mucky little midget! Squaggy little squib! Grubby little grub!" At last the BFG got clear of them all, and in another couple of minutes the pack of giants was out of sight over the horizon. Sophie popped her head up from the pocket. "I didn't like that," she said. "Phew," said the BFG, and far between there was a nasty, crouching mood today, was they not? "I sorry for you was having such a wriggling time." "No worse than you," Sophie said. "Would they ever really hurt you?" "I isn't ever trusting them," the BFG said. "How do they actually catch the human they eat?" Sophie asked. "They is usually just sticking an arm in through the bedroom window and snatching them from their beds," the BFG said. "Like you did to me." "Oh, but I isn't eating you," the BFG said. "How else do they catch them?" Sophie asked. "Sometimes the beverages said. They swimming in from the sea like fishes with only their heads showing above the water, and then out comes a big hairy hand and grabbles someone off the beach. Children as well? Often chittlers, the BFG said, little chittlers, who is building sandcastles on the beach. That is who swimming wants our father. Little chittlers is not so tough to eat, and all grandma, so always child-chewing giant. As they talked, the BFG was galloping fast over the land, and Sophie was standing right in it. His waistcoat pocket was now holding onto the edge with both hands. Her hand and shoulder were open, and the wind was blowing in her hair. How else do they catch people? She asked. All of them have their own special ways of catching the human being, the BFG said. The man-tripping giant is preferring to pretend he's a big tree growing in the park. He's standing in the park in the dusky evening, and he's holding great big branches over his head, and there is a wanting until someone happy families is coming to have a picnic under the spreading tree. And the mid-tripping giant is watching them. They lay out their little picnic. But in the end is the mid-tripper who is having the picnic. It's so awful, Sophie cried. The goblin giant is a city lover, the BFG went on. The gizzard gobbler is lying high up between the roofs of houses in the big cities. He is lying there snuggy as a singer and watching the human beings walking on the street below. And then he sees one that looks like it has a wispy good flavor. He grabs it. He is simply reaching down and snatching off its treat like a monkey taking a nut. He says it is nice to be able to pick and choose what you're having for your supper. He says it's like choosing from menu. Don't people see him doing it? Sophie asked. Never is they seen him. Do not forget he is a dusky dark at this time. Also, the gizzard gulper has a very fast arm. His arm is going up and down quicker than Squinkers. But if all these people are disappearing every night, surely there is some sort of an outcry, Sophie said. The world is a whooping big place, the BFG said. It has 100 different countries. The giant is clever. They is careful not to be skidding off the same country too often. There is always witch finding around. Even so, Sophie said, do not forget, the BFG said, that human beings is disappearing everywhere all the time without the giants is guzzling them up. Human beings is killing each other much quicker than the giant is going it. But they don't eat each other, Sophie said. Giant isn't eating each other either, the BFG said. Nor is giants killing each other. Giants is not very lovely, but they is not killing each other. No is crocodile kicking other crocodiles, nor is pussycat killing pussycats. They kill mice, Sophie said. Ah, but they's not killing their own kind, the BFG said. Human beings is the only animals that is killing their own kind. Don't poisonous snakes kill each other? Sophie asked. She was searching desperately for another creature that behaved as badly as the human. Even poisonous snakes is never killing each other, the BFG said. Nor is the most fearsome creatures like tigers and rhinoceros. None of them is ever killing their own kind. Has he ever thought about that? Sophie kept silent. I's not understanding human beings at all, the BFG said. You, as a human being, and you saying it's a grisling and horrendous for giants to be eating human beings, right or left? Right, Sophie said. But human beings is squishing each other all the time, the BFG said. They shooting guns and going up in airplanes to drop their bombs on each other's heads every week. Human beings is always killing other human beings. He was right. Of course he was right, and Sophie knew it. She was beginning to wonder whether humans were actually any better than giants. Even so, she said, defending her own race, I think it's rotten that those faux giants should go off every night to eat humans. Humans have never done them any harm. That is what the little piggy wig is saying every day. The BFG answered. He is saying I has never done any harm to the human being, so why should be eating me? Oh dear, Sophie said, the human beings is making rules to suit themselves. The BFG went on, but the rules they is making do not suit the little piggy wiggles. Am I right or left? Right, Sophie said. Giants is also making rules. Their rules is not suiting the human beings. Everybody is making his own rules to suit himself. But you don't like it that those beastly giants are eating humans every night, do you? Sophie asked. I do not, the BFG answered firmly. One right is not making two lefts. You is quite cozy down there in my pocket. I'm fine, Sophie said. Then suddenly, once again, the BFG went into the magical top gear of his. He began hurrying forward with phenomenal leaps. His speed was unbelievable. The landscape became blurred, and again Sophie had to duck down out of the whistling gale to save her head from being blown off her shoulders. She crouched in the pocket and listened to the wind screaming past. It came nothing as though the tiny people in the pocket and whooshed around her like a hurricane. But this time the BFG didn't stay in top gear long. It seemed as though he had had some berries to cross a vast mountains, perhaps, or the ocean, or a great desert, but having crossed it, he had once again slowed down to his normal gallop, and Sophie was able to bob her hand up and look out once more at the view. She noticed immediately that they were now in an altogether paler country. The sun had disappeared above a film of vapor. The air was becoming cooler every minute. The land was flat and treeless, and there seemed not to be no color eating at all. She noticed immediately, and every minute the mist became the thicker. The air became colder still, and everything became paler and paler until soon she was nothing but grey and white all around them. They were in a country of swirling mists and ghostly vapours. There was some sort of glass underfoot, but it was not green, it was as ashy grey. There was no sight of a living creature, and so no sound at all except for the soft thud of the BFG footsteps as he halted on through the fog. Suddenly he stopped. "We is here at last," he announced. He went down and lifted Sophie from his pocket and put her on the ground. She was still in her nightie and her feet were bare. She shivered and started around at her whirling mists and gaudy vapours. "Where are we?" she asked. "We is in a dream country," the BFG said. "This is where all dreams is beginning." Dream catching. The big friendly giant put the suitcase on the ground. He bent down low so that his enormous face was close to Sophie's. "From now on, he's keeping as still as winky little mice," he whispered. Sophie nodded. The misty vapor swirled around her. It made her cheeks damp and left dew drops in her hair. The BFG opened the suitcase and took out several empty glass jars. He set them ready on the ground, with their screw-top remote. Then he stood up very straight. His head was now high up in the swirling mists, and it kept disappearing, then appearing again. He was holding the long net in his right hand. Sophie, staring upwards, saw through the mist that his colossal ears were beginning to swivel out from his head. They began waving gently to and fro. Suddenly, the BFG pounced. He leaped high in the air and swung the net through the mist with a great swishing sweep of his arm. "Got him!" he cried. A jar, quick, give me a jar!" Sophie picked up a jar and held it up to him. He grabbed hold of it. He lowered the net. Very carefully, he tipped something absolutely invisible from the net into the jar. He dropped the net and swiftly clapped one hand over the jar. "The top," he whispered. "The jar too quick." Sophie picked the screw top and handed it to him. He screwed it on tight and the jar was closed. The BFG was very excited. He held the jar close to one ear and listened intently. "It's a wing squiffler," he whispered with a thrill in his voice. It's even better. It's Phil's wizard. It's a golden fizz wizard." Sophie stared at him. Oh my, he said, holding the jar in front of him. "This will be giving some little toddler a very happy night when I is blowing in it." "Is it really a good one?" Sophie asked. A good one, he cried. It is a golden fish wizard. Is it not as often as I get in one of these? He handed the jar to Sophie and said, Please be still as a starfish now. I is thinking there may be a whole swarm of fizzwords up here today, and do kindly stop breathing. You is terribly noisy down there. I haven't moved a muscle, Sophie said. Then don't, the BFG answered sharply. Once again he stood up, tall in the mist, holding his net at the ready. Then came the long silence, the waiting, the listening, and at last, with surprise and sadness, came the leap and the swish of the net. Another jar, he cried. Quick, quick, quick! Then the second dream was safety in the jar, and the top was screwed down. The BFG held into his ear. When the second dream was safety in the jar, and the top was screwed down, the BFG held it to his ear. Oh no, he cried. One means my maggots. Oh, swipe my swogglers. What's the matter? Sophie asked. It's a troglamter, he shouted. His voice was filled with fury and anguish. Oh, save our souls, he cried. Deliver us from whistles. The evil stands in my tipter. What are you talking to? Sophie said. The BFG was getting more distressed every moment. Or bash my A-bones, he cried, waving the jar in the air. I come all this way to get lovely golden dreams, and what is I catching? What are you catching? Sophie said. I is catching a ransom, troglamter, he cried. This is a bad, bad dream. It is a worse than a bad dream. It is a nightmare. Oh dear, Sophie said. What would you do with it? I's never letting it go, the BFG cried. If I do, then some poor little toddler will be having the most card-bloodling time. This one was the real Kixie Bug Thumper. Eyes exploding as soon as I get home. Nightmares are horrible, Sophie said. I had one at once, and I woke up sweating all over. With this one you would be waking up screaming all over, the BFG said. This one would make your teeth stand on end. If this one got into you, your blood would be freezing for icicles, and your skin would go creeping across the floor. Is it as bad that? It's worse, cried the BFG. This is a real whoopsie crop switcher. You said it was a troglamter, Sophie told me. It is a troglamter, cried the exasperated BFG, but it is also a bug trumper and a crop switcher. It is all the three riddle into one. Oh, I is so glad I is clutching it tight. Ha, you wicked bits, you, he cried, holding up the jar and staring into it. Never more is you're going to be bung-buggling but poor little human beanie toddlers. Sophie, who was also staring into the glass jar, cried out, I can see it. There is something in here. Of course there is something in here, the BFG said. You's looking at the frightsome troglamter. But you told me dreams were invisible. They is always invisible until they is captured, the BFG told her. After then they loosen a little of their invisibility. We see in this one very clearly. Inside the jar, Sophie could see faint scarlet outline of something that looked like a mixture between the blob of gas and bubble of jelly. It was moving violently, thrashing against the sides of the jar and forever changing shape. "It is wiggling all over the place," Sophie cried. "It's fighting to get out. It'll bat itself to bits." The nastier the dream, the angrier it is getting when it's in prison. The BFG said, "It is the same as with wild animals. If an animal is very fierce and if you're putting it in the cage, it will make a tremendous rumble-dumps. If it's a meese animal like a cockatoo or a foggle-trump, it will be said quietly. Dreams is exactly the same. This one is one nasty, fierce, bog-trotting nightmare. Just look at him splashing himself against the glass." "It's quite frightening," Sophie said. "I would be hunting to get this one inside me on dark some night," the BFG said. "So would I," Sophie said. The BFG started putting the bottles back into the suitcase. "Is that all?" Sophie asked. "Are we going?" It is so upset by this drug lamping, bug-dumping gobswitcher, the BFG said, that I is not wishing to go on. Dream catching is be finished for today. Soon Sophie was back to the waistcoat pocket and the BFG was racing home as fast as he could do. Then at last they emerged out of the mist and came again into the hot yellow wasteland, and the other giants were sprawled out on the ground fast asleep. A trouble hunter for the flesh lump beater. They is always having 50 wings before they goes scampering off to the hunt human beings in the evening, the BFG said. He stopped for a few moments to let Sophie have a better look. Giants is only sleeping every then and now, he said. Not really as much as human beings. Human beings is crazy for sleeping. It is ever occurring to you that the human beings is a 50s, spending about 20 years sleeping fast? I must admit that never occurred to me, Sophie said. You should allow it to occur you, the BFG said. Imagine it, please. This human beings who says is a 50 has been fast asleep for 20 years and is not even knowing where it is. Not even doing anything, not even thinking. It's a funny, though, Sophie asked. Exactly, the BFG said. So, what I is trying to explain to you is that a human being who says he's a 50 is not 50, he's an only 30. What about me? Sophie said. I am 8. You is not 8 at all, the BFG said. Human being babies and little children is spending half their time sleeping, so you is only 4. I'm 8, Sophie said. You may think you're 8, the BFG said, but you has only spent 4 years of your life with your little eyes open. You is only 4, and please stop higging me. Teach a little Snowy weepers like you should not be hidden around with a long cage in onions who's hundreds of years more than you. How much do giants sleep? Sophie asked. They's never wasting much time snuzzling, the beverages said. 2 or 3 hours is enough. When do you sleep? Sophie asked. Even less, the beverage answered. I is sleeping only once in a blue baboon. Sophie, peeping out from the pocket, examined the 9 sleeping giants. They look even more grotesque now than they were awake. Sprawled out across the yellow plain, they covered an area about the size of a football field. Most of them were lying on their backs with their enormous mouth wide open, and they were snoring like frogs. The noise was awful.